This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The UN and partners on Monday released their latest global poverty index, which shows around 1.2 billion people in 111 developing countries are living in acute multidimensional poverty. That's nearly double those classified as poor based on the definition of having to survive on less than $1.90 per day. And it doesn't take into account the current cost of living crisis or effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the new index finds that reducing poverty at scale is possible and unveils new poverty profiles that can offer a breakthrough in development efforts to reduce it, said the UN Development Programme, UNDP. The analysis looks beyond income to understand how people experience poverty in different aspects of their daily lives, from access to education and health to living standards such as housing, drinking, water, sanitation and electricity access. The new UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, took office on Monday in Geneva, vowing to champion a global human rights system that speaks to every human being. He said his office, OHCHR, would be guided first and foremost by the impact our work has on the people that we serve. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to every situation, he added. Mr. Turk said the mandate for the High Commissioner encompasses deep engagement with everyone, including governments, human rights defenders, civil society, as well as very clearly speaking out when it's necessary. He said he would not be bound by any agenda beyond the founding charter of the UN, adding that he did not see engagement in public advocacy as incompatible, but rather mutually reinforcing. And finally, above-average rainfall and devastating flooding across West and Central Africa has affected 5 million people in 19 countries across the region, claiming hundreds of lives, the World Food Programme said on Monday. Tens of thousands have been displaced and over 1 million hectares of cropland have been lost in a region already in the grips of an unprecedented hunger crisis. This climate-related disaster is one of the deadliest the region's seen in years and is likely to deepen the already worrisome hunger situation for millions. These floods act as a misery multiplier and are the final straw for communities already struggling to keep their heads above water, said Chris Nikoi, WFP's regional director for Western Africa. He said the agency was on the ground helping flood-hit families get back on their feet by providing an immediate response package. Matt Wells, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. A new UN report released on Tuesday shows women's and children's health has suffered globally as the impacts of conflict, COVID-19 and climate change converge with devastating consequences for children, young people and women. The flagship Global Health Report, Protect the Promise, is authored by the World Health Organization, WHO, UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, the UN Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, UNFPA, and the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health. An estimated 25 million children were either under-vaccinated or not vaccinated at all in 2021, 6 million more than in 2019, increasing their risk of contracting deadly and debilitating diseases. Millions of children missed out on school during the pandemic, many for more than a year, while approximately 80% in 104 countries and territories experienced learning loss. Since the start of the global pandemic, 10.5 million children have lost a parent or caregiver to COVID-19. Parties to the brutal conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region must stop fighting immediately and work towards a peaceful and lasting solution, the newly appointed UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, said on Tuesday. He warned the latest alarming airstrikes risk seriously worsening the already devastating impact the fighting's having on civilians. He said numerous reports of civilian casualties and destruction across Tigray due to airstrikes and artillery had been received since conflict flared up again in late August. And although a communications blackout makes it particularly difficult to verify reports, it's clear that the toll on civilians is utterly staggering, Mr. Turk added. He reminded that under international law, indiscriminate attacks or deliberate targeting of civilians or civilian infrastructure amount to war crimes. And finally, as the number of children reportedly killed in recent protests by Iranian security forces rises to at least 23, the UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR, issued a statement on Monday condemning the unabated violent response. OHCHR said reports of arbitrary arrests and the killing and detention of children were deeply worrying. The nationwide protest movement began a month ago following the death in custody of Mahsa Amini, arrested by Iran's so-called morality police for violating strict dress codes. Children have been killed and many others injured in at least 7 provinces by live ammunition, metal pellets at close range and fatal beatings. A number of schools have also been raided and children arrested along with some principals detained for not cooperating with security forces. Under human rights treaties accepted by Iran, authorities have an obligation to protect children's right to life and their right to freedom of expression and peaceful protest, said OHCHR's Ravina Shamdasani in Geneva. The continued unnecessary and disproportionate use of force against protesters must stop, she added, calling on the authorities to hold prompt, impartial and independent investigations into all alleged violations. Matt Wells, UN News.
This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Nearly 500 million people will develop heart disease, obesity, diabetes, or other non-communicable diseases by 2030 simply because they do not exercise enough, the World Health Organization, WHO, said in a report published on Wednesday. The UN agency warned that the cost of inactivity will be severe, roughly $27 billion annually in extra healthcare costs, urging governments to promote the benefits of keeping fit. WHO's first-ever global status report on physical activity measures the extent to which authorities are implementing recommendations to increase physical activity across all ages and abilities. Data from 194 countries show that overall, progress is slow and that countries need to step up policies that get people moving. WHO Chief Tedros Ghebreyesus said the benefits will be huge, not only for people's physical and mental health, but also for societies, environments, and economies. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is on a 2-day visit to India. Mr. Guterres was at the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai on Wednesday, where he discussed the partnership between the country and the UN. He said India's upcoming presidency of the G20, the world's largest economies, will be an important opportunity to bring the values and vision of the developing world to the top table of the global economy. The UN chief added that he also counted on India's support in mobilizing G20 countries around debt relief. While in India, the Secretary-General will also take part in an event celebrating the country's 75th anniversary of independence. Next, he will travel to Vietnam to participate in a ceremony to commemorate the country's 45th anniversary as a UN member state. And finally, thousands of severely malnourished boys and girls in Somalia are at risk of dying, the UN Children's Fund UNICEF has warned, appealing for donors to step up support amid the historic drought affecting countries in the Horn of Africa. Agency spokesperson James Elder reported that a child is admitted to a health facility for treatment of severe acute malnutrition every single minute of every single day. Latest rates reveal some 44,000 admissions since August, or one child a minute, he said, speaking this week in Geneva. Severely malnourished children are up to 11 times more likely to die of diarrhea and measles than their well-nourished counterparts. Mr. Elder said, with rates such as these, Somalia is on the brink of a tragedy at a scale not seen in decades. Deanne Penn, UN News.
This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The World Food Programme, WFP, is delivering life-saving support to record numbers of people in Somalia, with over 4 million a month receiving urgent supplies to prevent famine in the face of the region's worst drought in over 40 years. The scale-ups helped keep the worst outcomes of Somalia's hunger crisis at bay so far, said WFP. But the situation on the ground remains dire, with a child admitted for treatment with acute malnutrition every minute, according to UNICEF. WFP's racing against time to beat projected famine and a death toll that could reach the tens or even hundreds of thousands. Over the last 6 months, WFP's more than doubled the number of people reached with life-saving food and cash assistance, from 1.7 million in April to 4.4 million in August. The UN priority agenda on women, peace and security is further away from achieving its goals than ever before, according to the UN gender agency UN Women. The latest report from UN Chief Antonio Guterres shows a sharp deterioration which is significantly impacting women and girls' survival in war zones. UN Women Executive Director Seema Barhaus said on Thursday, as the Security Council debated the issue, that at a time of unprecedented crisis, the last thing the world should do is walk back from its commitments. The report calls for empowering women human rights defenders, ensuring women have a seat at the table in peace talks, and more funding for women's involvement in peace and security. And finally, African leaders gathered in Mauritius on Thursday to mull solutions to the education gap highlighted by a new UN report which shows children on the continent are 5 times less likely to learn the basics than those living elsewhere. The ability of education systems to ensure even rudimentary literacy skills for their students has declined in 4 out of 10 African countries over the last 3 decades. The findings are published in the first of a 3-part series of spotlight reports called Born to Learn, published by the Global Education Monitoring Report at UN Education Agency UNESCO, the Association for the Development of Education in Africa, and the African Union. Manos Antoninis, director of the report, said while every child's born to learn, they can't do so if they're hungry, lack textbooks, or don't speak the language they're being taught in. Lack of basic support for teachers is another key factor. Matt Wells, UN News.
This is the news in brief from the United Nations. UN Human Rights High Commissioner Volker Turk has deplored the deadly use of force against demonstrators in Chad, including killings by live ammunition. Thousands took to the streets in the capital N'Djamena and other cities on Thursday to protest the 24-month extension of the transition from military to civilian rule. Some 50 people were killed and nearly 300 were injured, according to the authorities. In a statement on Friday, the High Commissioner's office called for calm and restraint. The crisis is occurring as Chad faces flooding affecting 1 million people. The UN and partners have so far delivered food, medicine, tents, mosquito nets, solar lamps, and other items to some 200,000 people. Moving to Nigeria, where the most severe flooding in the past decade has left more than 2.5 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, UN Children's Fund UNICEF reported on Friday. 60% are children, or some 1.5 million boys and girls. The floods have affected 34 out of the 36 states so far. 600 people have died and more than 1 million are displaced. Cases of diarrhea and waterborne diseases, respiratory infection, and other illnesses are already on the rise. In a statement expressing his sadness over the devastation, Secretary-General Antonio Guterres reiterated the UN's continued commitment to supporting the government and people of Nigeria. UNICEF said the floods are adding to the already precarious humanitarian situation in the country. A years-long insurgency in the northeast has displaced millions and devastated agricultural production. The agency is calling for additional funding to meet the growing needs. And finally, Mr. Guterres paid tribute to the strong partnership between the UN and Vietnam during a visit there on Friday. He was speaking in the capital, Hanoi, at a ceremony marking the 45th anniversary of the country's membership in the UN. He recalled that little more than a generation ago, UN staff were in Vietnam delivering food aid to a country ravaged by war, isolated, and on the brink of famine. Today, Vietnamese peacekeepers serving under the UN flag are coming to the aid of people elsewhere. Vietnam is among the 193 member states that make up the UN, which celebrates UN Day on Monday. The 24th of October marks the anniversary of the entry into force in 1945 of the UN Charter, the organization's founding document. Deanne Penn, UN News.